Let's head out to the hotline and bring on a good friend of the program, Ryan Koenigsberg from DNVR, thednvr.com. We bring these guys on. They do fantastic work. What's up, RK? How are you, man?
What's up, guys? Great to hear from you.
Definitely good to have you on. Yeah, I was having a conversation with Ben in the break, and he's telling me that we have to root for the Chiefs. And he's been on this kick for a while about the Chiefs and how, it's a good thing when the team in division is really good. And that's the team that you're aiming for and fighting for. I'm like, I can't physically bring myself to pull for the Chiefs for really anything.
Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. It's not just because they're in division you want to beat the best. It's also because when they win the Super Bowl, inevitably that roster starts to splinter as guys want to get paid. It makes it easier to beat going forward.
They're already a target. Let's ask RK. He's our guest. Ryan,
right, let's ask him.
Ryan, what do you think about all this?
Yeah, Ryan, I need you to do me a favor and smack Ben upside the head.
There's way too many Ryans on the show. We never have another Benjamin.
Done!
That is, no, absolutely not. We saw what happened the last time they won the Super Bowl. That was last year. Their roster didn't splinter at all. In fact, guys just signed for longer contracts. So that logic for me is out the door. But more importantly, you don't want your division rival to win back-to-back Super Bowls. That's something the Broncos have over them. You don't want them keep catching up to the Broncos in the race for most Super Bowls. So all the reasons. In fact, I can't come up with one good reason for why any Broncos fan should want the Chiefs to win.
Well, I mean, I can, my wallet. But besides that.
Well, see, that's what I did last game is I was just like, I'm going to put all my money on the Chiefs. And if they win, good. And if not, then I'll just refill my account.
There you go. Well, see, and then Broncos fans can put all your money on the Chiefs. And then if they lose, you get to laugh about them losing. And if they win, you collect money. The Chiefs made you money.
I'm all about that. That's my strategy 100%.
I've already won you over.
Hey, you guys had an article up there on Noah Fant. And, I mean, again, Andrew Mason does such a great job with these. And I mean, you guys do really great work. But I want to sort of just zero in on what the expectations for him should be. Because it feels like he has built on his first 2 years. And I think Broncos fans are hoping to get to that Julius Thomas, but maybe a better blocker level. But do you think he'll ever be a Travis Kelce? Are we putting too high of expectations if we're thinking he could be that?
Yeah, I think that's a bit too high. I think Travis Kelce is one of the best receiving tight ends in NFL history. So because of that, I don't want to set the bar quite that high. But I do think you want him to be one of the best tight ends in the NFL. Right now, there's a very clear gap, in my opinion, between Kelce and Kittle and the rest of the NFL. And so you'd like him to, get up in that group that's right behind them, and maybe even eventually, obviously Kelce won't be around for forever. Kittle's still got a ways to go, but, eventually move into that top tier, which is pretty elite company right now. But, yeah, I think you just want him to get into the conversation as when you're talking about the best tight ends in the league, you go, okay, so Kelce, Kittle, and then who? And I think, he is absolutely capable of getting into that conversation.
And the Broncos need that. The Broncos need that in addition to the receivers that they've drafted in order to be successful. But, I'm kind of looking forward to both tight ends. I thought Albert Okwuegbunam showed a little flash last year in limited reps, limited time out there, and had a connection with Drew Lock. I don't know if he has the same connection with another quarterback or not, but I thought he showed a little something. I'd like to see the Broncos get out of that bunch set 11 personnel stuff, get into some 12, let Okwuegbunam, let Noah Fant cook.
Oh, I'm 100% in on that. I think that especially if Drew Lock is a starting quarterback next year, everyone should be buying Albert Okwuegbunam stock. It was very clear when he was in there that they had chemistry on a different level, and he was, a couple drops away from having a really incredible start to his career. He could have had 2 touchdowns in his first ever game. Then, of course, he has the big touchdown in the comeback against the Chargers. So he showed some serious flashes for me, similarly to a lot of the Broncos' young weapons. Drops were an issue for him. So, it's something that he's going to have to focus in on just the same way that it's going to be a focus point for Jerry Jeudy and KJ Hamler as well. But you're right. Those two guys can be a very serious package of weapons to go along with And we didn't even get to see those two guys on the field with Cortland Sutton at the same time. Can you imagine the mismatch of Cortland Sutton, Albert Okwuegbunam, and Noah Fant running out of defense?
No, that'd be a lot of fun. Last thing here for you. We were having a conversation earlier about missing Matt Russell. And we've had a lot of discussions about what it means to have George Peyton taking over the GM position, but we haven't really had a lot of conversations about losing Matt Russell there in the director of pro player personnel. So what do you think that means in the short term, and what do you think it means in the long term for this organization on how they approach things?
Yeah, that'll be really interesting. Matt Russell, to me, his most important role was he was one of the few guys that I believed could say no to John Elway. I'm not exactly sure what the loss of him is going to be, and I think that this year you're going to see the Broncos kind of stick to the strategy that has been paying off for them in the last couple drafts. I think John Elway will have enough influence on George Peyton to say, hey, here's the strategy we've been using that's been really working for us in terms of taking captains, taking, guys who are very productive in college. So it seems obvious, but, so many teams get caught up in, if we can coach them up and this, that, and the other thing, and you end up reaching on guys that are with the raw tools that don't come around. So I think I don't know if you're going to see it this year, but maybe in the future as you move on, you might see the loss of Matt Russell a little bit more.
What kind of party is it going to be at the DNVR Sports Bar this weekend?
Well, it's going to be a good one. We got the tailgate on Sunday morning, but also there's an Avs game that leads up to the Super Bowl. So those two things mixed together at the DNVR bar are going to make for a very fun and, of course, socially distanced and compliant party at the DNVR bar.
So Tom Brady for a 7th ring or back-to-back for the Chiefs?
Oh, man. I mean, I think the Chiefs are going to win, and I fear they're going to do so comfortably. That's just what my gut feeling tells me.
Is that what you guys have at DNVR bets?
That's what I'll be giving out, that's for sure.
Okay. RK, we appreciate you, man. Thanks for the time.
Coming up.
What does Peyton Manning going into the Hall of Fame mean to Broncos fans?
Welcome back to Broncos Country Tonight with Ryan Edwards and Benjamin Allbright.
By the way, congratulations to Peyton Manning, who is a first ballot Hall of Famer.
And the adversity that dude had to overcome, like with Adam Gase as his offensive coordinator to get there.
Yeah, just think about what he could have done here.
Being born into a baseball family.
Yes, I know. Of course. Of course. But, I mean, it's not really a surprise at all, obviously. And then, we saw the video out there that Mike Chappell did as his, I'm just going to say his name, Peyton Manning. Thank you for the time. And then, kind of Mike dropped it.
Right.
What does Peyton Manning going into the Hall of Fame mean to Broncos fans?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I think it's because it's so foregone. I don't think there's like the anguish. I don't think there is the emotional connection, because the other thing is you share Peyton Manning with the Indianapolis Colts. You don't share Mr. Bolin with anybody. And yeah, there was that season with the Jets, but we don't really share Steve Atwater with anybody.
Right.
So I don't think the emotional footprint is as big. Was Peyton a larger shadow over Broncos football, a larger specter, a contributor to more perhaps than Steve in some ways? But I think the emotional footprint is smaller simply because, he's shared, and the anguish isn't there because you knew he was getting it. You knew he was getting it first. Everybody knew he was getting it. The nomination video was his name is Peyton Manning. I mean, come on.
Right, but he won he played his final years here, went to 2 Super Bowls, set a bunch of records.
I think
during that time.
The emotional thing for Peyton was winning the Super Bowl on the way out the door.
Do you think there's a little bit more there for Broncos fans because they haven't yet replaced him? They haven't really found their franchise quarterback. They haven't found the successor to Peyton
anything,
Manning.
I would think that would be bitterness and not the other way around.
No, I mean, but that has nothing to do with Peyton.
It's not, but it's just one of those things. Like there's an overall bitterness that they haven't settled the position since he got hurt in that Rams game, to be honest. The season before his last season.
Right.
Because he was never the same after that.
No, and I remember Sports Talk Radio ready to bench him, run him out of town. And, of course, he ended up being instrumental in that championship run. But I don't know. It's an interesting thing. I feel like Broncos fans right now, and they're going to be celebrating it. They're going to be really excited about it. It was one of the greatest eras, really, of Broncos football. They've had some great eras of Broncos football.
There have been, but that was a dominant era.
4-year stretch.
Dominant.
You just knew they were going to be a good team. You knew what kind of level of expectation would be on the team with him on it. You didn't know how it was going to end, but you knew that the goal every year was to be in not only in the playoffs, the goal every year was to be at the top of the AFC and be on your way to the Super Bowl. And that was the expectation.
Yeah, I think the other part of this was, there were some other Broncos teams that had great eras. But at least they had a foil in the division at that point. Kansas City wasn't bad during the Broncos run in the 90s. Kansas City was a good football team, Everybody in the division was bad when Peyton was here.
Yeah, the timing helped.
It really, is one of those. That's why it was so dominant. Because the Raiders are the Raiders. Kansas City went through that bad spell in between Dick Vermeil and Andy Reid. The Chargers chargered, inevitably. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it was just because I think Norv turned with Norv like the coach there for a minute there,
yeah.
and then you had McCoy took over for a minute. Mm-hmm. It wasn't a great era for any team in the division. Honestly, the Chargers might have been the hardest team in the division at that point in time.
Yeah, absolutely, and because of Phillip Rivers,
right? It was it's just interesting, but it was so dominant. I just think that there's not as emotional a connection with this because you didn't have to labor for it. You knew it was coming, it happened, and there you go. It's not like Steve where we were laboring for it. Mm-hmm. It's not like Mr. B where we were definitely laboring for it, and we're like, holy crap, what does the dude have to do?
Are we going to labor for Von Miller?
No, absolutely not. First ballot. I'm trying to think of some Broncos that are marginal. That's what I've been trying to do, is think of somebody that's marginal. And I'm trying to think of who that would be, like Chris Harris or Aqib Talib or something.
He's not necessarily viewed as a Bronco, but DeMarcus Ware, he probably will be in.
He'll get in. It might not be first ballot, but he'll get in. Okay. It should be first ballot, but I don't know if it will be. But I'm trying to think of guys that, will Welker get the Hall?
I think it's a conversation.
Welker was the most dominant. People don't realize that during that stretch, Wes Welker had the most receptions, yardage, touchdown of any receiver, including Randy Moss during that stretch.
Yeah. He was unreal.
Yeah, people they would say, oh well, Edelman was, but that's crap. Julian Edelman's a Hall of, he might be a Patriots Ring of Famer, but
yeah, well, he'll definitely be that.
But he's not. Julian Edelman's not a Hall of Famer. Wes Welker should probably be a Hall of Famer. But does he get? How much of the Broncos really going to count that? You're not really going to
count a lot of him, and that's the thing is like a lot of the guys that are coming up, at least in that era. For the Broncos, a lot of them are hired guns. I mean, even like Aqib Talib, like he's
hired gun. All the guys that coming through would be hired gun guys.
But what do you actually remember him for? Maybe more people will remember him as a Bronco. I don't know. I mean, I think of him as a Patriot and a Buck, and then of course he's a Ram. And
you think of him
bounced
as
around.
I hate to say this, but you kind of think of him as a mercenary corner around the league.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So they had so many guys that were kind of mercenary players, and I don't know if there's anybody else that jumps out, even though they had great teams, that jumps out as a surefire Hall of Famer. It would kind of have to come from the defensive side. So like I said, DeMarcus Ware will get in.
Chris, maybe?
Chris
I think
has
he's
a
Ring
shot.
of Fame, but I don't think he's Hall of Fame.
No, he probably isn't. And again, maybe you view him because he's been one of the most dominant slot corners in his era and that's a tough position. Like that's not one of those like you just say, well, I mean, you're great at that one thing, but when you start on the outside, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. It's like no, being one of the most dominant slot corners is a thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what Darrelle Revis, but
something that's interesting
as far as an outside corner.
If Chris Harris gets in, it'll be because of advanced statistics. It'll be because of the metrics era.
Yeah, it could be
because that's really what brought his attention. Places like Pro Football Focus actually helped propel Chris to the narrative of being the forefront of his position.
Coming up,
he gets kind of lost in the wash. So it's not like we haven't brought him up, and the stats are just mind-blowing.
Yeah.
Welcome back to Broncos Country Tonight with Ryan Edwards and Benjamin Allbright.
How do you feel about Peyton Manning, the Bronco, or the Peyton Manning, the Hall of Famer? Like, I think it's kind of an interesting conversation, too. We can get into that. Like, what is the Peyton Manning era mean? Because you certainly are shared with the Colts. And most people in the league are going to talk about him as a Colt. Like when he's going into the hall. Now, again, you don't have to declare. Mm-hmm. It's not like baseball where you're wearing a hat. Mm-hmm. But, there's a lot of people that are going to view him as a bit of a hired gun. I mean, it was for 4 years. And he obviously changed the trajectory of what this team. If Tim Tebow would have remained the starter, they never would have reached the heights that they reached.
No.
Like, I mean, even in the best case scenarios, the defense at one point becomes the juggernaut that it became, mm-hmm. right? And you have a great running game, and you have a talented group of receivers. You're never setting records like they did with Manning.
No, and to be fair, the defense wouldn't have, and wouldn't, because those guys came to play with Peyton Manning. All those guys came to play with Peyton Manning. Ware, Talib, all those guys, they came to play with Peyton. They weren't coming to play with Tim Tebow. And the offensive side of the ball, you sure as hell weren't getting a Welker here. You weren't getting Emmanuel Sanders here to catch balls, from a pass protector and fullback.
I had a text here coming in. We were talking about how we were pushing for Steve Atwater and Mr. Bullen. It says, why weren't you pushing for Randy Gradishar at the same time? Well, we have been.
Yeah,
it's a little bit of a different deal with Randy, where he's at. And I'm noticing that, look, the NFL as a TV product really kind of hit its stride kind of into the 90s and the 2000s. And it's not like it wasn't a big deal in the 80s. Don't get me wrong here. But like,
a lot of those guys get lost.
Yeah, they
do.
The
Mecklenburgs, the Gradishars, and it's not just with the Broncos.
60s, 70s, 80s.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, sometimes unless you were on the great, and look, the problem for the Broncos too is they actually had some great defenses in there. The Orange Crush, right?
Right.
But the thing about it is it just wasn't as well known as and it wasn't as big a market as like the Steel Curtain,
right.
or like the Purple People Eaters and the Chicago Bears' great defenses.
Yeah.
So he gets kind of lost in the wash. So it's not like we haven't brought him up, and the stats are just mind blowing.
Yeah, there's a couple of guys. Dennis Smith's a guy I think is borderline. But there's
Louis Wright.
There's some Broncos out there you could definitely be mentioned that should be in the list. And I have stumped for Mecklenburg and Gradishar both. But there's other guys. I mean, there are guys, that 80s era, there's a lot of guys that if you weren't on a dominant team or a team that was on, because again, you didn't have all the viewing choices that you have now where you could see all these games.
100%. That's kind of my point.
And it's like a guy like I've been stumping for years from another team, from the Rams, Henry Ellard, the wide receiver. How that guy's not in the Hall of Fame. If you get a chance to go look at Henry Ellard's numbers, and you ever get a chance to talk to Jim Everett about it a little bit, my goodness, how he's not in the Hall of Fame is a crime. He might be one of the best players not in the Hall right now. But Gradishar and Mecklenburg absolutely deserve it too. It's just, again, in the 80s you didn't have the viewing options, and if you weren't on a great team, a lot of times you got left behind, and those names, as we get further removed from them, kind of fade into the background a little bit, and unfortunately that's what happens.
Yeah, and so it's not that we haven't been stumping for Gradishar or Mecklenburg and some of these Broncos greats, but yeah, I mean, I really think that the advent of having NFL Sunday Ticket or having the Red Zone or having, again, you didn't have the option all the time of watching the game you wanted. Yeah, they had the local markets. But think about this. I mean, East Coast and West Coast bias and all that. I mean, that's real. I mean, I saw it firsthand as we were kind of pitching Steve Atwater. There were sometimes I joked with him. I was like, hey, man, if you were only a Jet for a little bit longer, you'd probably already be in.
Yeah.
Like, honestly, if you'd have played a couple more years with the Jets, and he had a pretty good season, he played pretty well out there. It was his last year, and he had a certain expectation of the level of play he wanted to be able to leave on. So he was done after that point. But I was like, man, if you would have been remembered even as a Jet for a couple of years, you might have walked into the Hall of Fame years earlier instead of kind of having to wait your turn.
There are, and unfortunately that happens. Unfortunately, in the media hub centers and things like that, there are those biases. You get larger contingents of media from those places and slanted coverage on that kind of stuff, and unfortunately that happens. But, with modern social media and mass communication and basically the Red Zone package and every game available now all the time, makes it a lot easier to be a more well-rounded fan of a sport and understand what's going on with each and every team versus, just the ones that are in New York or L.A. or, whoever the Pittsburgh, whatever the dominant team at the time is.
I'd also add that, the advent of fantasy football
that's helped as well.
Has also changed the game. I mean, the interaction that you have with not only your local teams, but the teams around the league. I mean, honestly, like the knowledge that fans of people that listen to this show or people that just interact with sports talk radio, I mean, it's huge. You know every roster, up and down. You know who are the top performers. Sometimes maybe not on like the defense and maybe not on the offensive line, but outside of that, you know most of these teams. You know who's doing well. There was a good portion of, I'd say, probably 70s, 80s, maybe even into the 90s, that if you didn't love a team or have a specific team because you just only saw your team in your market. It was funny, New Mexico, growing up down there, because I grew up in the 80s and 90s down there, we shared markets with the Cowboys and the Broncos. And if there was ever a conflict, we got Cowboys games, which was brutal. But again,
same thing in
just
Arkansas.
What it was.
You
Yeah,
had, you had Chiefs and you had Cowboys, and it was mostly Cowboys because the Jerry Jones connection, obviously. But you had Chiefs and Cowboys, and if there's any conflict, you were getting Cowboys.
Yep, every single time. So again, it isn't for lack of trying with Mech and with Gradishar, but that's just unfortunately how things have sort of shaken out.